Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to day two of the MaaS Scotland annual conference. Hope you had a nice relaxing evening and are ready to absorb some more. Our first session this morning continues a series of technical sessions, and this morning we're going to be exploring policy and procurement, both areas, of course, of huge importance as we aim to move MaaS from the sphere of innovation and demonstration to practical implementation and, of course, adoption. Just before I pass you on to our session chair, I just wanted to encourage you to engage as much as you can with the session through the chat and Q&A functionality available to you. Remember also that you can keep discussions going through our Slack platform that we're using as our partner networking support for this. All details for that should be in the chat now or will be very soon. Okay, I'd like to introduce you to our session chair, Dr. George Hazel. George will be familiar, I suspect, to many of you and is rightly regarded as one of our leading lights in mobility as a service. He was also, which you may or may not know, instrumental in the creation of MaaS Scotland itself. MaaS Scotland came off the back of a Scottish enterprise project that George led on the run-up to the formation of MaaS Scotland itself. And indeed, George remains on the steering board of MaaS Scotland. George, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Ali, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to October, and also to the MaaS Scotland Conference Technical Session 3. I noticed that Ali was freezing a bit, but the audio was still okay there, so hopefully you can still hear me if that same thing happens. As Ali said, I've been involved with MaaS. When I started being involved with this, it's actually about 14 years ago now. It was then called Complete Mobility or Smart Mobility. And then when we got to know Sampo in about 2011, MaaS as a phrase came in. So I'm very interested in this, still active in this, working as an advisor for one or two people. I'm a board member on Transport for Edinburgh as well. So really interested in this session today because policy and procurement sitting with innovation is often, there's often a difficulty putting the two together, and it would be good to hear the experiences of our three speakers. So first of all, I'd like to introduce first of our speakers, Fergus Worthy. Fergus works for Cenex as General Manager Scotland, formerly the UK's Centre for Excellence for Low Carbon and Fuel Cell Technologies. It's a not-for-profit organisation specialising in low-emission mobility and energy systems. And Fergus has also worked for the Energy Savings Trust and also for Transport for London. So really looking forward to what you've got to say, Fergus. If you could share your screen, over to you. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. George, thanks very much for that introduction and a very comprehensive bio. Just bear with me while I make sure I share the right screen. Okay, can somebody just confirm they can see my slides and it's changing to the second one?
Yeah, we can see that, Fergus.
Great stuff, thank you. Yeah, as always, the downside of going first is just making sure the technology is all working. So yeah, just to kind of build on George's introduction, so I've been working with Cenex for about 2 years, but working in the sort of sustainable mobility field for coming on 10 years now, which has flown by, I think. Cenex, we have been around since 2005. We were, as George said, originally the UK's Centre of Excellence for Low Carbon and Fuel Cell Vehicles. We were set up by an agency that eventually became BAYS, and also the Automotive Council, with the remit to kind of stimulate the early market for low carbon vehicles. So that was basically working with the supply side, so the manufacturers and the technology developers, but then also working with potential end users, fleets, both business and in the public sector as well. And we've really continued working in that space, so sitting in that niche between business and the public sector, and between the supply side and the end users for low carbon mobility and energy systems. Traditionally, we've done a lot of work around electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles, But the last couple of years, obviously with wider interest in shared mobility, with MaaS, with alternative modes, we've really branched out and done a lot more work on smart and shared mobility, which leads on to the topic of my presentation this morning, which is a series, well, there's two parts to it. So the second part is a series of roadmaps that we've been developing to look at how the rollout of different shared mobility modes might progress as we move into the 2020s. And a bit of background before that, which is to look at how policy is evolving in continental Europe and what we can learn from the experiences in other cities. So this is all being delivered under a project that we're currently leading called SUSMO. So this is a 3-year project. It's funded ultimately by EIT and then delivered via the Climate Kick. So basically what SUSMO is aiming to do is to help cities prepare for and really kind of maximize the benefits of the deployment of things like shared mobility modes, micro-mobility and MaaS platforms. So we are working with partners in Stockholm, Bologna, Sofia and Madrid. And crucially, it's the city authorities from each of those cities that are the key participants in this program. And then we also have additional partners in each of those cities, either a university or another academic or consultancy partner. And the idea then is really it's for the cities to take the lead to define what their needs are and their challenges and the problems they're encountering around the deployment of shared mobility and MaaS, what their opportunities are, and what tools and resources they need to develop and then share with other cities in the UK and across Europe. So on the right hand side, I'll just kind of highlight some of the areas we're focusing on. The modes in scope include everything from electric cars and vans all the way down to e-scooters, cargo bikes, e-bikes, etc. And some of the themes that have emerged from the program include behaviour change. So it's all very well putting in place things like an e-bike scheme or car club, but how do you actually get people to change their behaviour and use it consistently? Private sector engagement, so the piece around how the public sector and the private sector learn to work well together and speak each other's language. Policy, procurement and regulation, which I'll come on to in a little bit more detail later on. And data and payment platforms, because this is a really interesting area, I think, for cities, where they're often sitting on a huge amount of data on how people currently move and travel around their city, but they're just not always sure about how to kind of really apply that and use that to work out what alternatives would be best suitable for them. And then on the flip side, when they have an operator in the city, whether it's a car club operator or a scooter operator, making sure that that data is shared in the other direction as well, so the city understands who's using those schemes, what the benefits are, environmental benefits, cost benefits, etc. So within this policy, regulation and procurement work stream, what SUSMO is aiming to do there is really empowering the cities to use these levers that they have through policy, through regulation and through their own procurement to drive decarbonisation, to meet their air quality goals, to reduce congestion in the city while mitigating negative impacts, because these are some of the issues that we have seen around the world with the deployment of shared mobility. Now, I know this is obviously not, this isn't commonly what happens. These are very exceptional bad instances, but there is that perception among some people, city authorities, local authorities, that if we let some e-bikes or scooters be deployed here, there'll be impacts on streetscape, on block pavements, etc. But the cities have all the tools in a locker to make sure this doesn't happen, but it's just about knowing how to deploy those effectively. But the other thing it really crucially needs is an understanding of the technology. So what's the state of the art and what are the future trends across the different modes that we might be looking at? And that's what we've tried to help them with over the last 12 months. So moving on to just some policy examples to pick out a couple of examples of what we've seen in continental Europe. So Paris is a really interesting example because they've gone, I've put them as best practice, they've gone from a city that have sort of made some of those early mistakes that I've alluded to, and have then gone on a bit of a journey, and are now really a city that other local authorities can learn from when it comes to the deployment of scooters. So initially there was one operator that launched a shared scooter scheme back in 2018, and that was all fine. But then what happened was another 11 operators all decided to launch scooters in Paris as well, deploying a total of 20,000 units across the city in a 12-month period. And there was absolutely no control over that whatsoever. So street clutter was a problem. The streets became littered with the vehicles. People were complaining that there was an eyesore, high rates of accidents with vehicles and other vulnerable road users, etc. So in around about 2019, the municipality decided they needed to do something about this. So they put in a series of measures which included fines for riding on the pavement, and a sort of voluntary code of good charter that the operators had to sign if they wanted to operate in the city. Ultimately, that helped a little bit, but it didn't really, the problem was getting out of hand. More units were still being deployed. And, those sort of minor interventions just weren't proving effective. So they kind of had a look at it again and said, right, we need to do something about this. So they launched a tender exercise where they said, we'll tender for 3 companies, each allowed to operate 5,000 units each. They strengthened that good conduct charter so that it was mandatory for those 3 companies to sign it, and it actually bound them to meeting conditions set out by the city. They increased the fines for riding on the pavement, and really effectively put in dedicated parking spots as well. So it was really clear to riders and the operators where the scooters had to go back to at the end of each trip. This has now worked really effectively. What we're hearing from the municipality is that the schemes are really popular with users, but also, there's no issues or complaints coming from non-users as well. So other road users and pavement users are accepting of the scooters being on the streets. So yeah, it's really just about the city kind of taking that control and not sitting back and letting the operators just have the run of the city to deploy the units however they feel. And it's a similar story in Sofia as well. It's another really interesting example of good practice. So here they had a slightly different challenge, which was less about too many units on the city, but here it was how do they create that behaviour change? So how do they actually persuade people to give up their cars? It's a very car-dependent city, and start looking at e-scooters or other alternative modes. So they started by reallocating car parking spaces. I think they reallocated about 100 to start with, and they're now up to 200 city centre car parking bays that have been reallocated for shared bikes, mopeds, and e-scooters. And to be honest, I think this was hugely unpopular in the beginning. The residents of the city kind of couldn't understand why their car parking allocation was being taken away, and also why subsidies were being effectively given to these companies, because they were given these bays at free or discounted rates. But over time, that perception has changed. Utilisation of the scooter scheme is now really high. I think they have 2 operators operating in the city, and it's actually given the city then the chance to remove almost some of the controls in place. So initially, like in the UK, scooters were only legal to be used if they were rented. That's now been rolled back so that private ownership is allowed as well. So they're just able to kind of gradually tinker with the rules to make sure that they've still got the control that they need, but they are creating that behaviour change away from the car. And the really crucial thing that they've done really well in Sofia is that operators must share all the data they collect with the city authority. So the city has full visibility of, when the units are being used, for what journey types, any issues with damage, vandalism, all that sort of stuff as well. And, as we'll know, once you've got that data, you're then in a position to make interventions and get the outcomes that you want. Finally, in the UK, so we're obviously not as far along as continental Europe on the e-scooter journey, just because we're still at the stage where this is being trialled. So Cenex produced a report drawing together some of those learnings that I've described from the SUSMO project. And we published this back in July, I think. And straight away, Peterborough Council basically said they're going to review how they approach their e-bike and e-scooter deployment as a result of some of the recommendations in there, because the key point really to take away is the local authorities need to take an active role in e-scooter deployment, and that extends to MaaS and other modes as well. You know, they need to work collaboratively and make clear to the operators and the providers exactly what the boundaries are within which they can operate. So in this particular case, Peterborough Council have said, yeah, okay, we're not going to allow any operators just deploy in the city. We will license particular operators, and we will put in these local conditions around insurance, training, helmets, etc., to make sure that we head off any potential problems before they happen. Okay, so moving on to the second part now, and I think this will really help set the scene for Julie's and Sam's presentations later, because, you know, to understand MaaS and the MaaS platforms, I guess a crucial part of it is to understand the individual mobility technologies, how they're likely to develop over the next few years, and therefore how that can be best integrated into MaaS platforms. So what we've done is try to basically put together a series of roadmaps showing how we expect the technology across these different modes to develop over the next, say, 5 to 10 years, which is quite a tricky process because it's all moving so quickly that even to make firm predictions for 1 or 2 or 3 years down the line is quite tricky. And obviously after that, the uncertainty can be quite significant. But in order to kind of have a go at this, we have tried to triangulate data from as many different sources as we can. A big part of it is obviously the stakeholder engagement that we've done with SUSMO. So we spend a lot of time in conversation with city authorities and mobility operators in the UK, but also further afield as well. Talking to central and local government, from the EC through DFT, Transport Scotland, and local authorities, again, outside of the UK, to see what we can learn from countries that are perhaps further advanced than us. Talking to membership groups, so Coma UK, Bike Plus, and reviewing a lot of papers from research and academia as well. So this morning is the first time we've presented these roadmaps outside of the SUSMO group. It's important to say we definitely see them as a work in progress. So under that membership groups, I'm keen that we add MaaS Scotland in there as a sort of a group that we've consulted with. As I go through this, I won't present kind of everything that's in the roadmaps, because as you'll see, there's a fair amount of detail in there. But I would really encourage people after this, when the slides are shared, to have a look at this, get in touch with us, tell us what you think we've got right, tell us what you think we've got wrong, and we want to continue developing these and make them as kind of comprehensive and useful as possible. So the format of the roadmaps basically looks like this. So on the top, we have kind of forecast as we move from a development and enabling through transition and wider deployment phases. And on the left-hand side, we've categorized these into 5 areas. So technology, operations, environment, coverage, and economics. And then there's one of these of each for car clubs, scooters, bikes, and a wider municipality and strategy piece. So as I say, I won't kind of go through these in huge detail, and nor will I sort of expect you to read everything on there, because there's quite a lot of content in a small font. But just to pick out a couple of key points, I mean, I think for car clubs is at a really interesting junction at the moment, where you know, the optimistic view is utilisation of car clubs can really kind of take off as we go into the 2020s, and the environmental benefits will also grow from where they are today. So we know that car clubs already take, depending on the estimate, somewhere around 10 private cars off the road per vehicle deployed. They tend to then obviously have lower emissions than a privately owned vehicle, but it's the transition to EV that's going to get really exciting in the next few years. Widen that environmental gap over privately owned vehicles, and then particularly as the sustainability of EVs themselves improves as well, obviously that benefit will continue to grow. One interesting trend around operations, though, we've read a lot about the potential increase in a free-floating car share model, car club model, as opposed to a back-to-base model. And that's kind of at odds with the move to EV, which is probably going to require some sort of back-to-base model returning to a charge point. So that's something we still have a little bit of uncertainty around, and we'd be really keen to hear people's views on whether they think there will be this move to free-floating, or whether the need to come back and plug in an EV will prevent that trend from taking off. The other point to make on the EV as well is that if you look at the whole life cost of EVs compared to petrol and diesel cars, that, you know, already there's a whole life cost saving for EVs in many duty cycles, and purchase price parity is expected later this decade as well. So what that means is for any car club operator who don't really have an EV fleet by around 2025, they're going to be at a commercial disadvantage compared to their competitors that do. And in turn, that means there's a real first mover advantage. So the companies that are now starting to already look at EV within their fleet, they're going to be in a much better place, have that experience, have the infrastructure, have their customers used to the technology by the time that sort of, you know, suddenly reaches that kind of that mass adoption through exponential growth as we go into the first half of this decade. On e-bikes, so there's kind of two key trends we see with e-bikes. So one is for now a continuation and growth in sort of pay-as-you-go and subscription models. So the likes of the shared bike schemes that we've seen in London and Edinburgh, as opposed to private ownership of e-bikes. And this really just comes down to the fact that the price of the bikes is relatively high, and people are just uncertain about how to use them, how to charge them. You know, do you charge them at home? How exactly does that work? And plus the fact that they're so affordable just to rent by the hour or by the mile. That may change towards the second half of the decade, just as people become more accustomed to the technology and the price comes down. It might then be something that people own themselves. But for now, it's really going to be based around those shared models, with the exception of the second trend, which is cargo and e-bikes. So a lot of the work we've done, people are seeing that there's been some early development around e-bikes, cargo cycles, but again, they've been so far expensive, low range, and it's not something that's well understood. But as cities over the next few years start to really think about kind of minimizing vehicles operating in the city centre, managing congestion out, hitting their air pollution targets, particularly when they start to talk about getting to net zero carbon as well. You know, just trying to drive out as many vehicles as they can in order to reach that. It's likely there's going to be a huge uptake in interest in electric cargo cycles. The big issue with, sorry, go ahead.
Couple of minutes, Fergus.
Yeah, no problem at all. I guess the big issue with e-bikes though is just around the economics. So as we've also seen with e-scooters as well, basically they're only deployed profitably in larger cities, so over about 300,000. Again, as utilization increases, that may change, that threshold may come down, but certainly for smaller urban areas, there's likely to be a continuing need for public subsidy. E-scooters, I've said a fair amount about already in the kind of policy review section. I guess with e-scooters, again, like with the car clubs, it's at a bit of a junction. We really hope that the trials that are underway in England go well, and that the legislation allows the deployment of rented e-scooters, but done right with the appropriate controls in place and hopefully procured by the cities as well. There's been some issues around the sort of long-term sustainability of scooters, in that previously they've only had a shelf life of about 6 months and then they've been off to the scrap heap. Obviously that, despite what the carbon benefits might be on a per journey basis, that's not sustainable in the long term. It's not what we want to see. However, we know that the manufacturers are making huge strides on the durability of the scooters and on the embedded emissions in the batteries and the rest of the components as well. So, you know, we're really happy that there is an environmental benefit to e-scooters, and that's only going to grow over the next 5 to 10 years. And finally, George, if I can just have a last minute to complete this. On the strategy and policy side, I guess we're at the stage now where a lot of this stuff is being run through publicly funded trials, either by cities or national governments. And as they start to produce some successful results, I think that will transition then over to private sector leadership and private sector investment driving this forward. And again, as those trials start to produce some interesting results, the question is, okay, how do we then integrate that into MaaS platforms? So rather than making it more difficult for the consumer, more choice, more complexity, actually, how do we simplify that process so they can plan, book and pay for journeys across e-bike, public transport, car share, etc., whatever it might be. So at that point, I will wrap up, and I think that probably leads quite nicely into the following presentation. So as I say, I invite comments and feedback on those roadmaps once you've had a chance to digest them in detail, but also happy to take any immediate questions that you have at the end of all three presentations. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Fergus. That's brilliant. I see Jenny Milnes put up a comment, but there has to be questions on e-scooters. I know that something in Transport for Edinburgh we're debating hard at the minute. So can we get a couple of questions maybe on the e-scooters and how they fit with the MaaS system and regulation? Really interesting case studies in Paris and Sofia and Peterborough, and also the roadmap development, free floating car club model. Really interesting question. So a couple of questions on that would be brilliant as well. So thanks, Fergus. That's a great start. Let's move on to Julie. Julie works as project officer at CESTRANS, the Regional Transport Partnership for the area around Edinburgh, the Lothians, Falkirk, Fife, Scottish Borders, and Clackmannan. Since August 2019, CESTRANS has been a partner in the Interreg Europe PriMaaS project, a project which seeks to promote mobility as a service through policy development. So really interesting to hear about that. Over to you, Julie. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Let me just get my screen up and share my presentation. Let me know if you can't see that. Please give me a shout.
Looking good so far.
Okay. Okay, perfect.
Yep, that's it.
Thanks, George. And thanks, MaaS Scotland as well for the invitation to speak here today. It's really exciting. I think it's a really interesting topic, policy and procurement. It's certainly something I'm trying to get my head around, and certainly what this project that I'll be presenting today is really focuses on. So my name is Julie. I work as a projects officer for CESTRAN. For those who don't know, it's the Regional Transport Partnership for the southeast of Scotland. Represent 8 local authorities, and as a projects officer I mostly work on projects that revolve around sustainable mobility, shared mobility, or with a view to reduce carbon emissions from transport, improve connectivity, social inclusion, road safety, etc. So the project that I'll be presenting to you today is called PriMaaS, or PriMaaS, whatever you like. It's an Interreg Europe project that focuses on promoting MaaS through policy development. So just a very quick overview. I'll give you an introduction of the PriMaaS project. Then I'll talk a bit about our vision for MaaS and the role we think it can play in the southeast of Scotland, the area that we cover. I'll talk a bit about the project activities that have been going on so far. So it's around a regional stakeholder group and establishing a baseline of the different MaaS levels. Then I'll talk a bit about the exchange of experience, and that's been really at the core of this project so far. And I'll touch a bit on the role for the regional transport strategy in promoting MaaS, and finally the MaaS action plan that we'll be working towards in this project. I'll wrap up with a conclusion and sort of next steps. So first of all, introduction to PriMaaS. To give you a bit of background about the funding programme, it's an Interreg Europe project which really focuses on helping regions develop better policies through the exchange of experience. So it's really about working together, exchanging knowledge and exchanging policy experience, best practices, and the idea or the philosophy is that then helps to identify some best practices which can lead to the implementation of some of those best practices, which can then influence policy for the better. Just to give you a quick overview of the PriMaaS, the project kicked off over a year ago. I guess we're, like you said, George, we're in August, in October now. So yeah, just over a year ago. It's split up in 2 phases. The first 2.5 years focus on the exchange of experience. So that's when the real sort of most of the activities is going to be taking place, or is taking place rather, where we're establishing a baseline of the different levels of MaaS, identifying best practices and developing action plans for each region that's involved in this project to take MaaS forward and develop it further. The second phase is going to be a 1-year phase, and that's just going to focus on monitoring the implementation, because policy change can sort of happen over a longer period of time. So it's to kind of monitor the impact over that period. So just the consortium, there's 10 partners across Europe, including other regional or local transport authorities, transport associations, and some university departments as well. It's quite an interesting mix of different partners, all with different types of experience, and also the fact that it's so many different countries means that the sort of maturity or different levels of MaaS are at different stages. So it's great for exchanging that sort of experience and expertise. To talk a bit about the project objectives, obviously it's about promoting MaaS, so the integration of the way in which transport is offered as a service, which we're all very familiar with now, I think. But on top of that, it's not just about MaaS as a concept, it's also really about deploying MaaS in a way that can help achieve sustainable transport policies and priorities and objectives. So prioritizing low carbon and equitable mobility services, whilst improving the service and transport connectivity. And the idea is that that can all happen through the international collaboration and working with other regions and building that trust amongst stakeholders. And finally, the focus of the project is to influence policy instruments that will be specifically addressed through this project. I guess the other side of the coin is that we'll try and avoid some risks as MaaS develops. So that's around avoiding increased inequality, discouraging sustainable mobility. So if I can walk to the pub, but because I've still got 5 taxi trips in my MaaS allowance, then obviously that's and would potentially be encouraging additional car use or additional miles driven. So it's kind of thinking about how we can use MaaS as a concept to really promote sustainable mobility and integrate the transport hierarchy as well. Want to avoid higher costs for the end user. I guess the session yesterday as well also touched upon the user experience and user engagement, which is just something to obviously bear in mind to avoid higher costs for the end user. And the final point here, the digital gap transport is offered and used by a range of users, and how can we make sure that we have a system that really works for everyone and doesn't leave people disconnected. So this is just a bit of a messy graph, but it just kind of summarizes the different outputs that are planned. So hopefully after 3.5-year collaboration, this is what we as a consortium will achieve. I'll try and avoid the word, but this may or may not have been affected slightly by some external force. So we'll see where we are after 3.5 years, but certainly we'll aim to achieve this and find creative ways to continue that exchange of experience through an online format as well. And this is just the different policy instruments. It's a bit of a European terminology to use policy instrument. It's just it can be a strategy or some form of mobility plan. There's some sustainable urban mobility plans included as well. So really addressing policy instruments. And we'll be focusing on the regional transport strategy, like I said. So moving on to developing a vision for MaaS for the southeast of Scotland. Obviously, we want to focus on providing seamless transport, seamless mobility, for which MaaS has great potential. But we want to use this concept to work for other strategic and longer term transport objectives as well. So that's obviously around, promoting some societal goals around active travel, cleaner but also fewer vehicles, low carbon transports, accessible transport, and tackling transport poverty. So that's for those who are familiar with it, the sort of level 4 MaaS. Also, we'd like MaaS to see it develop in a way that it aligns to national policy. Then obviously the Transport Act and National Transport Strategy 2, but also the Climate Change Act, and the target to be carbon neutral by 2045, and including the interim targets, which, by the way, is the toughest climate law worldwide, which as an environmental lawyer by education, I find really, really cool and exciting. So I think that there's great potential, but we want to make sure that MaaS works to the benefit of us. And I think as an RTP, we have a statutory duty to produce a regional transport strategy, and that gives an opportunity for us to help shape that policy and help shape that development. So just to give you a bit of an example or an interesting graph here, this is a research article that was produced by Tampere University. It kind of shows the potential of sort of the cost benefits of certain measures to help achieve CO2 reductions as opposed to other interventions. And the first two bars, sort of the blue and the red, they're negative values, but they denote that these measures, so that's car and ride sharing and developing urban form and modal shifts, can generate or have potential to generate larger monetary benefits than costs. So it's really sort of showing the potential impacts shared mobility and modal shift can have on achieving our climate objectives. And I think I certainly believe that MaaS can play a critical role in promoting shared mobility and encouraging modal shifts by providing mobility in a seamless manner. And there's a role for MaaS to facilitate that behavioural change and to help make that shift from ownership to usership, which are not my own words, by the way. So just moving on from the vision onto the activities that we've been doing and focusing on so far. So far we've been working to establish a baseline of the different levels of MaaS across all the project partner regions, to sort of develop a common understanding of the types of integration of transport services in each region. We've set up a regional stakeholder group to facilitate that discussion and sort of gather that expertise and experience for our region. So we started off with these 4 levels of MaaS, which first produced in 2017 at the first international conference on MaaS, which kind of provided the basis. And during our first stakeholder workshop, which was held in January 2020, some in the audience may have even attended that as well. We discussed these different levels of MaaS and the different platforms that exist in Scotland, and considered them in light of these different levels. We kind of realized that some fit with, you could argue it's a level 1 or a level 2 or a level 3 or a level 4, potentially the MaaS projects that will be coming could potentially be a level 4 MaaS. But we realized that these levels things are a bit more complicated than that. So we realised that as a consortium, and kind of started working on our own assessment of MaaS levels and the integration based on the information gathered by each project partner through those regional working groups. So that led us to put all that information together and put it into a sort of MaaS table, which looked at different levels of customization of each platform, different modes, types of information, the scope or coverage, levels of personalization, different payment options, and then finally the integration of societal goals, which then led us to establish the sort of MaaS level. And we're pulling all of that information together into a baseline assessment report, which we're just finalizing at the moment. And that will help us identify some best practices across the consortium, which can help us focus our activities moving forwards, which has really focused on the exchange of experience, like I said before. So the project's been running for a year now, and the exchange of experience is focused mostly on the exchange with Finland, where MaaS has been developed a bit further than here in Scotland, I guess. So that's been a really useful exchange of experience, where when we went over to Tampere in January 2020, very dark time to be in Finland, but really exciting as well. We received a presentation by the Ministry of Transport for Transport and Communications, and they set out a very clear vision for MaaS, which led to the adoption of an Act on Transport Services, which covered areas around providing better and more agile services, making better use of vehicles, having smarter travel change, and provided some provisions around data utilization and regulation, as well as deregulation and market access.
Minutes, Julie.
Oh, thank you. That's going really fast. So I'll just move on quickly, just on the Finnish Act on Transport Services then. Whether your opinion on MaaS is whether it should be developed bottom up or top down, with the example of Finland, legislation has been an enabler. So it's set out provisions requiring operators to provide essential information on mobility services, and secondly to require open access to sales interfaces of ticketing and payment systems. So the law, I guess, has really played a key role in enabling that sort of data sharing, which is really, really key, and I'm not the first one to say that. Data is a key element in this, and how do we move forward from this baseline, and how can we develop MaaS further? What are currently the barriers to MaaS? Just very briefly on the Scottish context, so compared to Finland, on access and availability and interoperability, the Scottish Transport Act provides some opportunities around bus service improvement partnerships and some provisions allowing Scottish ministers to develop regulation that can through which operators may be required to share data, which is really, really key for MaaS to be taken forward. So our role then is to, I guess, influence that sort of right type of policy to be developed through the RTS, and how can we use the RTS to enable MaaS and align to those transport policy objectives. The steps that we'll be taking is that we will be moving from this baseline to a sort of action plan. We're currently looking at rewriting the regional transport strategy, for which we've developed a main issues report. We've also done a demand responsive transport study and a mobility hub study. The DRT study really considers the value of DRT, and also identifies that MaaS has some potential to optimize DRT services. And mobility hubs, for those who don't know, are potentially the sort of physical infrastructure integrating shared mobility to existing forms of transport. So really the sort of bricks to the bytes, if you like. All this work will help us adopt the right policies through our strategy to enable further MaaS development, whilst protecting those policy objectives around sustainability and quality. So moving forward in the project, based on that experience, exchange of experience with project partners, we'll be taking this forward and develop an action plan to support MaaS initiatives and be involved as a stakeholder, considering different learnings and around governance and procurement and things like that. The MaaS Investment Fund also offers new opportunities to look at MaaS initiatives. So just to wrap up, because I'm conscious of time, besides showing you my favorite color and mode of transport, I'll just move on to the next steps. We're being challenged to be creative and work and progress this project in an online format, but we'll be continuing to work and finalize the baseline assessment report, continue the regional stakeholder workshops, identify best practices which potentially can be implemented in our region and exchanged, and we'll all be working towards developing an action plan on the steps forward within mind that we can influence the regional transport strategy which we'll be working towards. So that's all I'll say for now. The link to the project website is just on the slide there, and I'm happy to take any questions during the question and answer session after Sam's presentation. I'll just hand back to you, George. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And we've got a couple of questions there as well. So over to Sam. Sam lies a Senior Innovation Officer at Transport for Greater Manchester, the innovation team. And current areas that he's working in is MaaS, 5G and connectivity, future connectivity, AI and data, and smart cities. So Sam, over to you. Welcome.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Just let me share my screen. Hopefully it will work. There you go. Yeah, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and invited to speak at MaaS Scotland. It's always difficult going last because a lot of the topic areas has been covered. So my presentation will be a bit more, I think, thought-provoking and kind of thinking around what are the specific areas that we're looking at and kind of questions we have as a whole at the moment. So just a bit of context, in Greater Manchester, this is our Death Star, or our network diagram, as we call it, and it showcases the different rapid transit modes that we currently, have in place or will have in place in the near future, both from Metrolink bus, walking and cycling and rail. But one of the key things to bring out is that we're seeing more emerging kind of future mobility propositions, such as micro mobility with your scooters, e-bike ownership, car share agendas, and it's going to be very difficult, without a clear digital platform or digital provision to integrate all these propositions together to achieve our cities and the kind of regions objectives as a whole. And with a lot of work we've been doing on MaaS, how it ties back to our kind of wider Transport 2040 strategy, as a whole, to achieve some of the decarbonisation agendas, to achieve some of the visions of the city's growth, and kind of future of transport land planning as a whole. And on top of that, with MaaS, there is a proposition that links wider into kind of the UK industrial strategy. And when we start thinking about mobility as a service, it's all about moving a thing from A to B, and for people to access services as a whole. So what are the challenges that links into areas of clean growth, future mobility, AI and data, and more importantly, things such as the aging society. So in Greater Manchester, we do things differently, whether or not it's better for worse. But as part of the innovation team, what we try to do is establish a model when we work with partners on focusing on critically around commercial sustainability and working on innovations and transforming that innovation into business as usual activities. I think number of projects we've done over the years, the biggest challenge is always how you transition from a trial into, to use the word procurement and the business as usual activities as a whole. And what that then means from an internal transformation perspective for the companies, for the organizations as a whole, and how we do things differently. And I think just quickly touch on, with a lot of the innovation projects, we take a very much learn by doing approach, and we iterate on a number of our kind of agendas and themes over time, to get us closer to integrating as a core business activity. So when I saw the heading of the session, it was policy and procurement. I kind of shivers for a little bit, because it's a very difficult area to talk about without getting into trouble. But I think one of the key things we really should to start to think about as a starting point before we jump into that is kind of what is the public sector role within this ecosystem as a whole. And a colleague spoken already talks about the different MaaS models that are out there at the moment in terms of how it fits together. So this is some of the examples from that's been adopted over the years by players like UITP, EMTA, Polis, and the International Transport Forum around what MaaS provision looks like as a player. I think we've seen a lot of propositions of that Model 1 piece in terms of this wall garden approach with individual apps. We're starting now to see people slowly transitioning towards this public MaaS perspective, where you have a combine of a public transport authority that facilitates, but again, just only going to one app. I'll talk a little bit more about kind of Model 3 and that open-ended back-end platform, regulated back-end platform, but more open proposition around kind of just linking supply and demand in the sense, in terms of this regulated utility MaaS. And then finally, the really futuristic and kind of buzzworthy kind of ecosystem that people are looking at is kind of this decentralized MaaS ecosystem, when we start talking about blockchain and distributed ledger technologies and smart contract and what that looks like. I'm not going to talk about that today, funnily enough, because it's still slightly further away, but just to give you a mind of what's coming at the moment. So once now we talked about the models, is around how we and what is the relationships that we'll want to build with commercial partners as Transport Authority, and how we go about building those relationships as a whole. So in TFGM, we've been working on this kind of model of the commercial relationship with MaaS operators over the years, and it's been kind of a guiding model for us to reference against. On the slide, you can see Model A is very much around kind of TFGM being a MaaS operator and using in-house resources to directly control and manage the transport system as a whole. That Model A proposition is very much a TfL approach, and some people may correct me if I'm wrong here on that. The Model F approach is very much around a private sector is the MaaS operator, has full control over the operation, and is very much for a free market approach to the environment. And we're starting to see that in some ways, that private operators are engaging with MaaS providers to come up with new propositions as a whole, where the public sector body isn't directly involved fully or integrate it into a proposition. And that also raises a challenge in itself, but it gives a bit of flexibility to get things moving quite quickly. As a whole, we starting to see some of this in players like West Midlands that initially trialed kind of their WIM proposition that kind of looked at that, but I think their model's now shifted slightly over the years. I think for us at TFGM at the moment, we're looking at very much around that Model C and D proposition in terms of how we work in partnership, not necessarily to control. I think from a public sector point of view, that word tends to be quite attractive to a lot of players, but how do we influence the right behavior and making sure that we're getting the kind of achieving the city objectives, while at the same time the MaaS operators are creating commercially sustainable solutions as a whole. So over the years, we've been working on a number of European projects as a whole. These are just the two of them. iMove was one of the projects that we focused very much on the technical aspects of MaaS and what that means, feeding into future kind of our technical requirements and kind of policy and regulations. But he also looked at kind of areas around accessibility guidance and kind of that international compatibility piece. When we start scaling up MaaS in terms of the single point of access for all mobility needs, we really want to look at how we can replicate that so that the single solution can be used elsewhere within Europe as a whole. I'll talk a little bit more about iMove in a second. For MaaS VU, this is a bit more of a challenging project as with the trial period is during COVID. So it's been very difficult to really get some understanding of how the solution would work as a whole and how people will interact with it. This focuses specifically around business models and creation of MaaS toolkits as a framework that any city can pick up as a baseline to create MaaS propositions. So what are the legal documents that needs to be put in place? Is it collaboration agreements? Is it sharing agreements? What are the best practices around data sharing that needs to be incorporated as part of those kind of memorandum of understanding and legal agreements as a whole? And linking back into kind of this wider behavior evaluation of how do we ensure, the MaaS data is used effectively. So with the iMove trial, with a lot of the MaaS work we've been doing, it's been very much around partnership rather than procuring a specific solution. So on the iMove trial, we worked with a major employer, which is Manchester Airport, to try and transition their employees out of their personal car to drive to work, but actually, using the well resource transport infrastructure available at the airport to really provide a MaaS provision as a whole. And we facilitated that partnership with a commercial MaaS provider to create that proposition and to integrate the different mobility suppliers in the market to really understand and see how it would work, and kind of for all of us to really learn what the opportunities are to scaling this up into other kind of major businesses as a whole. So that's kind of our general approach, because I think at current where the market and the environment and the ecosystem is so in flux still, that to really procure something puts us in a challenging environment, that as the environment changes, is it still going to be fit for purpose? Are we going to end up missing on opportunities as a whole? So when we talk about MaaS, I think a lot of the stuff around policies and procurement needs to be around MaaS as policy for the good, and trying to achieve some of the city objectives. So what are the things around, traffic demand management that we need to do a little bit more on with MaaS, where we get insight from mobility providers to help people pre-plan journeys so that sustainable modes are more used. What are the data we can get from mobility operators to feed into our smart city system on traffic management so that we can prioritize, certain vehicles as a whole? Is there a gap for the mobility MaaS operator in terms of capacity data or information on pricing that can help them integrate their solutions better as a whole? And kind of scaling that up in terms of, MaaS is a tool for aggregating and collecting, purely what the demand is out there at the moment in terms of mobility requirements, and also what the supply in the mobility system. So how does that link into a dynamic network management component as well? Aggregating different demands and predicting travel patterns in the future. And that big question around what is the regulatory role, for a transport authority within the ecosystem, and thinking about it a little bit wider, as colleagues touched on around EV, is there a wider partnership that needs to be brought into play, once we talk about electric charging for, car share vehicles and so on and so forth to fit that MaaS agenda. And finally, with the MaaS proposition, how do we link into the kind of the right mix? So what is the right number of bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, car shares, frequency of services that helps us achieve some of the city vision of sustainable travel and the right modal mix as a whole? Because what we want to avoid is everybody jumps on the MaaS package and then using on-demand solutions because it's the most convenient. So how do we influence some of that using regulation and policy? So some of these are the areas that we have been considering in terms of regulation. So one of the biggest challenges around kind of the power or the curse of the default, we've all been there with using Google or Citymapper as a journey planner. It gives you a default proposition as a whole, and that becomes a lot of the time the proposition people use. So what are the rules we need to start looking and putting into place that ensuring that the default achieve some of our city objectives as a whole, or ensure people are provided a safe route to travel when they walk, and so on and so forth around that on the MaaS platform side of things. On the wider piece, how do we minimize the barrier of entry and making sure there's an open marketplace for potential MaaS solutions as a whole? In this environment where we're not crystal clear on what the requirements and the provisions needs to be on the MaaS proposition, how do we make it so that it's about quality of providing the services to the customer and making sure that it's not just dominated by big players such as your Googles as a starting point. I think Julie touched on a little bit of this already in terms of what's the minimum digital rule of play for a mobility operator to operate within our city. You know, is there a component around data for the mobility supply and how it's being used? Is there a component around access to the digital ticketing and kind of the future, the access to actually procure the service itself? And, you know, playing a little bit of devil advocate, is there stuff that we need to start exploring around minimum and maximum distance for modes, you know, to achieve some of the city objectives that we want? You know, should we be putting a minimum distance of 3 miles for on-demand provision, or should there be a maximum on for Uber so that public transport get used as well? You know, so it's considerations like that we need to start having to think about. And then, you know, again, Julie kind of touched on this around digital inclusion and inclusivity as a whole. You know, how do we ensure the bankless isn't left behind? How do we ensure that people have accessibility needs are catered for as part of the MaaS proposition? Not just on the physical provision side, but on the digital side as well. COVID, you know, crisis has highlighted that we are increasingly more digital, and more services will be going that way. How do we ensure that, you know, people are getting the solutions that they can still access as a whole? And, you know, just a final one to touch on in terms of that regulation piece. We've seen a big rise in terms of super apps within kind of the eastern areas, mainly in China, around WeChat and Alipay, you know, as a proposition that fundamentally can solve a lot of the MaaS challenges as a single point of, because a lot of the provisions are around payments. You know, so how do we take those players into consideration in the future so that it's not just about mobility as a whole? So I talked a lot about kind of the policy side of things and kind of how we go about working in partnership. I think one of the components we need to start considering is how do we build that digital platform so that we can allow those lower barrier of entry, that we do take into consideration of potential cybersecurity and resilience component, and also, you know, what insight do we need from a data perspective? And I think when we boil down MaaS down to the lowest common denominator, you know, a MaaS platform, one of the key roles is to connect demand with supply as a whole. And the demand actually is changing in terms of where it could be generated. I think traditionally we would think it's just a mobility app that generates the demand, but actually it may be hotel bookings that are now starting to generate the app. It may be, you know, when you buy a ticket to a theatre event or football matches that generate that demand. So how do we create that system where those demand generators can access all the mobility supply that's available within the city as a whole? And this kind of ties back into that third model that cities are looking at in terms of this aggregational platform. So as a transport authority, we facilitate the transaction between the demand generator and the supply generator, working with some sort of integration MaaS provider. And for us to really gather the data and the insight, you know, to help us better manage the city, but at the same time influencing the right journeys to be made to the demand generators as a whole to achieve some of our city objectives and some of our city investments, you know, predominantly in Greater Manchester around active travel as a whole. And further things to consider, you know, in the post-COVID recovery world, are we going to change the way in terms of how we access services as a whole? You know, are we still going to go and travel to our corner shop, you know, to pick up the various provisions, or are things going to be starting to come to us? What are the opportunity with freight and the policies around that we need to consider that incorporates into mobility as a service offering as a whole? So I'm just going to kind of finish up with kind of a question to the participants on the call to kind of that I'm interested in kind of finding out is kind of what do you feel is the biggest opportunity for MaaS in this kind of from a COVID recovery perspective, and kind of from all the commercial operators and kind of maybe not public sector partners to really understand what are the barriers you feel to achieving some of this. So that's a quick canter through. Thank you very much for listening to me speak. I hope that was insightful, and I'll pass it back over to George, I think.
Brilliant, Sam, thank you very much. I have so many questions and we've so little time. I'm going to steal 5 minutes and take it to 10:50. I've got permission for Ali to do that. So if the panelists, if you could keep your answers reasonably short, we'll try and get through 2 or 3 questions. One of the questions I've got here from Kate, ITS Leeds, is about e-scooters. Now there's a lot of debate about e-scooters. She says, I'm finding it very difficult to see how e-scooters really solve a problem for more than a niche of the urban population, and the throwaway nature of them concerns me greatly. With a move to the 15-20 minute walkable neighbourhoods and indeed city, I'm not sure what real e-scooters would have in the mid to long term. Comments from the panel?
Shall I start? Because I think that came in during my presentation. Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpick there. There's like 2 or 3 different questions in there, so I'll have a go while trying to keep it brief. I mean, firstly, on the sort of throwaway thing, historically that's definitely been a problem, and I think I touched on that in the presentation. The fact that operators are building these things with a shelf life of just a few months, and that was the end of them, which is no good. We don't want to see that, obviously. Both from a carbon perspective and use of materials, energy, etc. But that's something that has improved greatly. I mean, Cenex is, we're not here to represent scooter operators or anything like that. This is our independent view of it from looking at the research. So yes, the shelf life of the scooters has improved, and they're also building them such that rather than, if one part fails, like the battery or the motor reaches the end of its usable life, that's the end of the whole unit. Rather now they can be refurbished and reconditioned, and that part replaced. It's really important to think about what journey a scooter is replacing. So if it's replacing a journey that somebody would have done by walking or cycling, clearly, even if it's an electric scooter, that's going to increase emissions. There's question marks about what happens when it competes against things like a bus. But certainly if you're moving people from a car onto a scooter, even taking those life cycle emissions into account, it's hugely beneficial from a carbon perspective. And then secondly, just briefly on that sort of accessibility and inclusivity piece, there's kind of 2 sides to the coin on that. So yes, scooters aren't going to be open to all members of society. There are some, I guess, kind of physical and capability and confidence barriers to entry, for sure. So yes, there are only going to be certain people that ride them. Conversely, they provide a really, really low cost way of moving around a city. So for some people where owning a car or even access to a car club, where the financial barrier can be real, scooters can help to overcome that. And the final thing I'd say on that as well is that even if it does only take that narrow demographic out of their cars and onto scooters, but other people living in the city will still have a benefit from reduced congestion, reduced air pollution, etc., because there are people not in their cars that were previously. So I take your point, but I'd argue there's nuances where there can be sort of indirect benefits on some of the people, even if they can't directly access the scooters themselves.
Okay, thanks, Fergus. Sam?
Yeah, just add to that. I think I also touched on in terms of the walkability and kind of cannibalizing walking. I think, the same argument has been said around electric bikes as well, that, people aren't going to walk more because they're going to hop on bikes. So it's finding that balance and kind of making sure that influence the right behavior. I think from a Transport for Greater Manchester point of view, all these new mobility modes, we're still trying to understand kind of what the real opportunities are. I mean, the commercial sustainability is the biggest kind of worry where, in Manchester, we had the Mobike scheme, and everybody loved it, but it wasn't necessarily commercially sustainable, so, we're kind of quite cautious on that and in terms of how we make it work and where it fits in terms of that wider provision. I think one thing just to quickly touch on around the usage of e-scooters, it opens up kind of as a stepping stone for other more sustainable modes. With the scooter itself, if people start using it on our active travel infrastructure, they may become more confident to use a bike on that infrastructure in the future. And at the same time, I think with all the data we can capture, we can start seeing what routes actually has a high uptake, of scooters and start really understanding the purpose of those trips and whether or not they can be transitioned into something else in the future. So for us is a stepping stone for more active travel, but also collecting data and insight.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Julia, have you anything to add to that?
Yeah, just resonate with what Sam was saying. I realised that Kate, who posed a question, couldn't hear Sam. I just read that in the notes, so I'll just repeat a bit what he said. But essentially, and I would agree that I think scooters can be a stepping stone into sort of this idea of sharing and using rather than owning transport or mobility, which I think is really, really key. I do share Kate's concerns around sustainability And I'd be interested, and Fergus, you mentioned that e-scooters can potentially, remove people driving cars. But I think the type of journeys that you would make with an e-scooter, I'd be inclined to think that it's more replacing journeys by foot or by bike rather than so much by car. But I'd be interested to see if there is evidence of, maybe in Paris, where it's been shown that e-scooters replace car journeys. I don't know if there is any. That's actually more of a question myself.
It's good to look in details of the case studies Fergus said. Julie, while you're on, there's an interesting question again from Kate actually, but I've been following the Finnish thing over a number of years, and it's about the open APIs and the legislation that they passed. Was the network of operators there technologically sophisticated enough to take this on board without additional public investment? In the UK, I'm thinking of Glasgow for one. There's a lot of small third sector operators who might struggle with that. And it's always good to look at Helsinki, but Helsinki's always been pretty well set up for transit and a different regulatory system. So
yeah,
Sam,
obviously,
well, but over to you, Julie.
Yeah, obviously there's the VR, like the transport provider there in Helsinki, but as far as I know anyway, that there was support provided by the Ministry of Transport and Communications to help some of these smaller and third sector operators to provide that technological support, but also some monetary support to make that investment into the hardware. So I guess, it's sort of the law on the one side requiring that step to be made, and then the additional support from the government provided to help some operators make that shift. But I could see if I can get more detail on that.
Yeah, okay. Sam, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think on the API of things, it's really interesting. I think from my personal perspective in the UK, it applies mainly for your traditional operators. All your newer operators are, thinking with that mindset to maximize their commercial opportunities, to having a digital access to the platform. And I guess it comes back to how, whose role is it to do that? Is it a public sector role so that we get that data and the insight, to facilitate, that aggregation platform, or is it, as a requirement to the operator to do this as a minimum requirement to play in the system, and how it's going to be financially maintained? I think that's the challenge.
Yeah. Sam, when you're on, I want to come back to Dave Holloway's comment about crofting model. Have a read of that. That's really interesting, and it gets us sort of looking at MaaS in the rural area. But one of the key difficulties I'm still seeing around the world is that we still don't know really, companies still don't know really what the commercial model is for a MaaS system. And there's all talk now about B2B rather than B2C. And the role of the public sector. And I'm really interested in this joint sort of JV model, because public and private. Actually, in Scotland, I've always been fascinated by the SPT Nevis model, whereas, well, it's Visa now, it was Rambus and ESEPS before, but Visa is that coming together of the two. Do you think that's the way forward?
You're putting me on the spot a little bit here.
I am. It's being recorded too.
I think the reason why we went with kind of major employers is, I think traditionally when we look at mobility and transport, is always very much around commuting as the challenge that we try and tackle, right, as a whole, because people use cars to commute and we're trying to reduce congestion as a whole. And that kind of resonates. I think the reason why we started looking at that commercial, working with major employers and that commercial relationship is the fact that there is an opportunity, well, there is a revenue opportunity for the businesses to contribute and provide this as a staff benefit, and actually to ensure that the staff, are living more healthily, using active travel modes, or for their business travel, they have a more seamless way rather than just paying for mileage. So there are definitely kind of commercial drivers for employers to implement this proposition as a whole. Whether or not that's the right model, I don't know. I think with future work, the way it's going at the moment, it's going to be very interesting whether or not MaaS could be a way of influencing major employers to open satellite offices rather than a major office in the regional centres, you know, providing that as a gap to get to those places. So yeah, it's more to think about.
Okay, we're going to have probably time for one more, depending on your answer, but that question from Dave, which gets into, I mean, you know, around Greater Manchester there are deep rural areas. The same with Sestrans, and I don't know if Senex Fergus gets into this, but what Dave said there is, you know, folk I know in smaller settlements who want to have a car club, been looking at crofting model to build up the use that makes a car club viable, but also provide low cost for online shopping, providing local taxi, DRT. I could add peer-to-peer community car share into that. And, you know, he follows up by saying a crofter will have many nested jobs, the only practical way to sustain a settlement in more remote parts of Scotland. This is a big issue of can MaaS somehow help rural communities in terms of sustaining rural communities economically and in terms of quality of life and all the other policy things you were talking about, Julie. Any comments of that? Who wants to come in first? I'm
happy to start because we're doing some research into something around this at the moment. So we've been commissioned by Como UK to basically look at what are the factors that go into making a successful rural shared mobility scheme. Because they have, you know, there's a pretty good understanding of how that works in an urban environment, but less so in some of these remote and rural and island locations in Scotland specifically. So it's work that's still ongoing, so there's not huge amounts I can say in terms of kind of outputs from that, but there will be a report with a summary of that research and what the factors are, and that will ultimately then feed into a tool to help community organisations, small community organisations that want to put in a car club or some other form of shared mobility, to really understand whether it's likely to be viable, what are some of the things they need to consider, where they might be able to access support and funding, etc. So it's really to watch this space, but we should have something that we can share in a month or so's time, I guess.
Great, thanks, Fergus. Julie, Sam, anything to add?
Yeah, I think rural transport is a really interesting one. I think traditionally transport in rural areas is just obviously focused a lot on local bus services or community transport. But I think with where we are heading now with the National Transport Strategy 2 and the transport hierarchy, it's just, I guess, just considering transport more holistically and looking at all modes together and providing for all those modes in a holistic way. So I guess it's kind of just rethinking the way in which transport is provided in a rural setting as well. So and I guess something like MaaS has got great potential to use that sort of technology to optimize services, and rather than, you know, potentially shift away from fixed bus routes and services to more demand responsive services. Obviously there's always that challenge of, you know, making something commercially viable, but that's I guess just an ongoing challenge in a rural setting, but that would be with anything. I guess if you could optimize services or, you know, provide other active travel solutions for the first and the last mile, you could, you know, have a bus and a community bus running to the town from the town centre, connecting different towns, and then you could cycle the last mile of your journey. Or I think that there are options, and I think it's just a matter of, you know, you'd be doing the same in an urban context, but in a rural context as well, just looking at transport more holistically and not each mode by itself.
Yeah. Thanks. Sam?
It's a very difficult one for me to answer, actually, because I'm just trying to, because a lot of this kind of, because as transport, we always think that is around connecting people from A to B, right? And, you know, I keep bringing up the COVID crisis, apologies, I know we're sick of hearing it, but for me, it's the biggest opportunity to change the way some of the communities are built up and designed, and whether or not is more around kind of things becoming more localized as a whole. I mean, the 50-minute kind of city thing that Paris is starting to looking at, making things more walkable and accessible, kind of key part to that. And we're always also starting to see a trend where people moving away from regional centres in London and working in a more rural environment because they can remotely work. So that model in terms of what mobility provision will look like rurally may fundamentally change from getting from their home to a rapid transit rail or tram station to get to their work to, accessing local shops, accessing satellite offices nearby, regenerating your smaller towns as that proposition. I think just on the one last thing on the craft model side of things, I think there's a unique opportunity around sharing of assets, that are multi-purpose. So just an example on the DRT side of things, DRT may be great during certain time of day to moving people, but actually there's a unique opportunity for it to be moving freight, linking to kind of storage lockers that mobility hubs that Julie talked about, and kind of storage lockers and what freight looks like as that cohesive proposition.
Brilliant. Okay, guys, that's a fantastic session. We've got lots more questions. Note there are a couple of comments for the panelists just to follow up on, and also Julie mentions next Friday, I presume a week on Friday, is it, Julie? An event sponsored by MaaS Scotland about the very thing that we're talking about in terms of Scottish Rural Islands and the Transport Convention 2020.
Is Jenny Milne, is that the one she's organising? Is that
yeah.
The Scottish Rural and Islands Transport Convention.
That's the one. So thank you guys very much, and thank you for all the questions. We'll certainly be following these up. And just before Ali, I hand over to you, I realised I made the most horrendous mistake when I described Sustrans. I missed out Fife. And for all those that are listening and around the world, the Kingdom of Fife, where I was born and brought up, is the most fantastic place in the whole of Scotland, and I missed them out. So apologies to my friends in Fife. Sustrans.
No
I might be allowed back.
Thanks, George. As an Ayrshireman, I might have to take issue with that, but I understand your point. That's perfectly valid. Listen, thank you, George, for clearing that so well, and for all our panelists. Clearly, it's an area that we can only scrape the surface of in an hour and 15 minutes, but I hope that everybody who joined us today was able to take home some key points or some useful learnings from this. So it's just really for me just to kind of close up by saying a reminder that everything is recorded, so this session will be available online fairly soon up on the MaaS Scotland website. Please do continue the conversations we see on Slack.